if, on the remote possibility that he does attack, Johnson says, quote, our intelligence agencies show you will, and I'm quoting Johnson, whip the hell out of them. There are only, on those two questions, will Egypt attack? The answer is no. And if it does attack, what will happen? Our intelligence agency said, even if all the countries attack simultaneously, and even if they start hostilities, you'll win, to quote at that time Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, you'll win in 7 to 10 days. Meyer Amit comes to Washington. When he discusses this, he says, quote, all of your estimates and predictions are the same as ours. There is no disagreement between the Israelis and the Americans that Nasser is not going to attack. Under international law, number one, there wasn't even a case here of a preemptive attack because Egypt wasn't going to attack. You're not preempting anything. And the closest argument you can make is an argument, as we made in the case of Iraq, for what's called a preventive war, that at some point down the line he may attack, so we should prevent it. But that's illegal under international law. Preventive wars are illegal. The second question that was put to me was, well, if it were a defensive war, what does the law show? The law is clear. Look at the first statement of UN Resolution 242. It says, quote, emphasizing the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Emphasizing the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Notice it doesn't say aggression. Namely, it doesn't say you're not allowed to acquire territory in a war of aggression if the war is a defensive war or an aggressive war. It's immaterial in the international law as it's flowing from the UN Charter. Regardless of whether it's offensive or defensive, you can't acquire territory by war. And so my answer is, even if it were a defensive war, which it wasn't, Israel would still have no title to those territories. It's not my opinion. It's the law. Now, you're asking me, you used an expression at the very beginning. You said, the sources I use, as if my sources are suspect. But what were the sources? Is the International Court of Justice a suspect source? It was the court that said it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war, quoting UN Resolution 242. It was all 15 justices who said it's illegal. That's not me. That's the law.
Can I add just one sentence?
Sure.
The start of the 67 war occurred on May 22nd with the act of war by Egypt in the blockade of the Straits of Tehran.
Well, that would be an interesting fact were it true. If you look at Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, it says you're allowed to act in self-defense. Look at the words. It says against an armed attack. Armed attack. even if it were true, and it's not, time doesn't allow me to go through it, it's not. But even if it were true that there was a blockade in the Straits of Tiran, that's not grounds for war under international law. It was not an armed attack. That's why there was talk about Israel sending a vessel through the Straits of Tiran, hoping Nasser would fire on it, and then they would have the pretext, because it would be an armed attack. But a blockade under international law, it's just not true. Regrettably, most of what we know about the conflict is simply distilled through Israeli propaganda. I have gone through that record very closely. Immediately after the war, there was a meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, the 5th emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly. Now, this is literally true. There was not one country in the world, not one, which said that Israel acted in self-defense in June 1967. The position of the United States, Arthur Goldberg, I was our U.S. ambassador at the time, the position of the United States was both sides were responsible for the escalation of hostilities. There was no country in the world that went on record, apart from Israel, as saying it acted in self-defense in June 1967. That's just a mythology that was created by a very efficient propaganda machine, the same one that had people believing for 40 years that the Palestinians fled due to Arab orders in 1948. There is no evidence for this.
Hello. I hope you bear with me. I want to read what I want to ask you and what I want to say. My name is Rick. I've recently created, last week as a matter of fact, a new Zionism awareness blog at www.zionism.blogspot.com, if you want to take a look at it. Professor Finkelstein, I have 2 questions for you with a brief review of a question I posed to you a year or so ago when you appeared at the University of Marquette. At that time, I asked you whether Americans needed to be educated on what Zionism is. I define Zionism as Jewish apartheid, Jewish exceptionalism. Your response was no, that the concept of Zionism had already received enough exposure. Perhaps that is the case in your immediate circles, but if you go to any shopping mall around here, with the exception of Bayshore maybe, and you ask anyone about Zionism, you'll find virtually everyone you ask doesn't have a clue what it is. They've never heard of it. It could be a new flavor of ice cream for all they know. So my 2 questions. Why do you suppose that here in America we hear from our media so much about Islamofascism and radical Islam, but we hear absolutely nothing about Zionism, Jewish apartheid? Question 2. You are to be commended for raising your voice about the injustices imposed on Palestinians. It's courageous of you doing that. How is it that so many justice activist Jews are able to see the injustices imposed upon the Palestinians for the sake of Zionism, but still seem to believe that Zionism, Jewish apartheid, can be had nicely? That somehow there can be Zionism, Jewish apartheid in the Middle East, without war and conflict?
Well, my answer hasn't really changed from last year or a year and a half ago. I said at the end of my remarks, I see no point whatsoever in engaging in sloganeering or using a terminology that's going to alienate people. Why can't we use simple terms and concepts which everybody understands and which distill the essence of the conflict? I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Zionism, so I have some sort of stake in it, but I never bring it up in these kinds of meetings because I don't see the necessity of doing so. Why can't we use a simple language about human rights, international law, which everybody does understand, and then try to create a consensus on resolving the conflict, rather than dragging in a language which is only going to cause new digressions, create unnecessary enemies, demand different kinds of litmus tests and oaths of loyalty, which are only distractions from trying to resolve this conflict. What does it even mean to be a Zionist? I asked Professor Chomsky, he says, I've been a Zionist since I'm 6 years old, and I haven't changed at all. Oh, I thought to myself when he said that, my goodness, at 6 years old I was just learning how to tie my shoes and zip my zipper. And he's already a Zionist at 6 years old, and he's already figured it all out. But whether he is or he isn't, is it really important for trying to reach consensual principles for resolving the conflict? Does that make him an enemy? Because in his view, his understanding of Zionism, he's a Zionist. I just think these are things which unnecessarily divide us. And we really have, in my opinion, stay away from it. Just quote the human rights reports. Quote the International Court. Quote what Israeli historians and good American and British historians say in the subject. And not try to create divisions when they're just not necessary.
With all due respect, I assume that, again, with your last name, you are Jewish. Mm-hmm. If, in fact, Israel is such a despicable, horrific country mm-hmm. as you make it out to be, then where, in fact, would you place a Jewish nation?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I were to give a lecture on the United States, I don't think the picture I would portray would be particularly flattering to what the United States does around the world. I was asked here to speak on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And although I'm painfully aware that what the United States does in the world in any single day is probably many times worse than Israel has been able to do in the whole history of the conflict, it doesn't mean I want to displace the American nation. I think I started out by saying, given Barack Obama's current candidacy and the fact that it's viable, kind of makes me feel proud in some respect, like Barack Obama's wife said, to be an American. But I don't see any virtue when people are suffering to wave the flag. I don't find that particularly admirable. And I don't think it's particularly admirable to try to drag in extraneous and phony issues in order to deflect attention from what Israel is doing. Is there a single statement, a single word, a single punctuation mark of mine which anyway implied that I thought that Israel didn't have a right to be there? I think what I said was from the get-go, when I went to the International Court of Justice statement on the topic, I said that the basic principles are that the Palestinians have the right to self-determination and statehood in the whole of the occupied territories. And I said there was a second principle of international law, Article 2. Every state, member state of the United Nations has the right to be free from threats or use of force. And I think I said under that principle, the neighboring Arab states and the future Palestinian state have to recognize Israel's right under Article 2. Now, why do you drag in, where do I want to put the Jewish nation? That's exactly what I'm talking about this evening. You drag in totally extraneous issues in order to deflect attention from the factual record. And the factual record is, for 40 years, Palestinians have had to endure a brutal occupation. And I think that's where our attention should be fixed. Yeah.
How has the immigration of non-European Jews of color played a role in the Israel-Palestine conflict?
if you mean